Great. Well, thanks very much for including me in this program. I had the privilege of participating in this conference several years ago, and it really was a wonderful experience then. And I would have liked to have repeated the in part aspect of that conference, because it was really wonderful to meet with a number of care providers and to be able to exchange personal stories. And I think that that's really where my place fits in this conference. It's really about the person. The title, I'm Still a Person, is a title really that was gifted to me by my mother. In a period of dementia, we had a conversation and I said something that I can't even remember what it was. And obviously, from my mother's perspective, it wasn't sufficiently respectful. And she admonished me, and her response was, "I'm still a person." And as you can tell, even just by the tone of my voice, that's something that really stuck with me and resonates with me. And it's really what I try to bring to the work that I do in this area, to remember that no matter what else is happening around the individual is still a person. So let me say at the outset that I have no financial relationship with any commercial interests. I have nothing to sell. But more importantly, I want to say that I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And I recognize that I'm very fortunate to live and work here. And I acknowledge that I benefit from the dispossession of my Indigenous neighbors. There are 3 discrete learning objectives for today's session that I want to share with you. And that's just sort of as a reminder, but also a little bit of a structure for what I want to be able to say. So broadly speaking, I'm going to be talking about ethical issues, but not necessarily any one specific issue. It's under the broad rubric, of caring for older persons. And periodically, you'll hear me make particular mention of persons with dementia. You've already heard me acknowledge that my mother suffered from dementia. My mother passed away before COVID, but I can tell you that many of the thoughts I had during the initial period, which was really quite frightening for many people, made me reflect on how she might have been treated and how she might have coped. I then also want to describe what I see as an evident tension between truth and respect for persons. And I want to talk about this again, partly in caring for those with dementia, but also in terms of people who are competent when we have truths to say that are perhaps life-threatening. And then I want to end by talking about what I think is most important in this arena, which is this concept of identity that I have that rests not only on memory, but perhaps more importantly, on recognition and belonging. That's what gets us to remember that at the end, I'm still a person. So these are images that may be familiar to some of you from a special program that was aired not that long ago. And what's important about these images or this story is that they're actually reflective or representative of what many people said and continue to say, which was that the system failed, that there was a breakdown, a very serious breakdown in the care that we were able to offer to seniors, especially those living in long-term care facilities. What you see here, and I think what's really important, is this idea that there were already problems and that what COVID did was actually bring them to the fore, amplify them, really make sure that we could no longer turn a blind eye. And one of the things that I think is really important, and it gets repeated in almost every talk that I hear, is this notion of having to pay attention to dignity. So here the statement is solutions to help seniors age safely and with dignity. But where my emphasis is going to come in is with the emphasis on dignity. And I'm not the first person to say this. Those of you who were here yesterday will have heard in a very, I think, impassioned presentation from Andre Picard, the same kind of concern and a real emphasis on problems about ageism and the lack of dignity that was shown to people in these healthcare settings. What you see here on the slide are 2 quotes that I think are particularly important. And I want to read, if you will, a little bit of karaoke here, the second statement, which says, If the growing cohort of seniors, and that's a fact that we're aware of, is going to age with grace and dignity, that's the conditional. If they're going to age with grace and dignity, and that's all of us, much needs to be done to provide better primary care, more accessible home care, better housing, more friendly communities, more support for caregivers, better income supports, and policy changes that address deeply ingrained ageism. I wholeheartedly support everything there, and I'm sure that all of you do. But in today's presentation, I don't want to focus on the structural problems, which are many. I don't want to focus on the financial problems, which are challenging. And I don't want to focus on the politics, which absolutely need to be addressed. I want to talk indirectly about ingrained ageism by talking about the absence of respect that we have for those who are aging. Again, yesterday, many of you will have heard a presentation by Carol Estabrook where she highlighted a number of important points in the report on the future of long-term care that was prepared by the Royal Society of Canada. And you heard her summarize, again, some of the profound, long-standing deficiencies in the long-term care sector, and again, how these were exacerbated or made more evident by the pandemic. And again, you're hearing a need for urgent reform. Again, I'm not going to focus on those issues. And in her case, I think she spent a lot of really good time telling us about problems, challenges with workforce issues, the absence of proper ratios of patients to care providers, of inadequate training, inadequate compensation, et cetera. So those, again, really important. And I'm sure that everybody agrees with that. But she also made the point about ageism. And again, that's the point I want to carry over to in my presentation, where I'm able to focus on, again, on the issue of respect. What does it mean to respect an aging population? Well, respect will get us to do those important things, will get us to make those structural changes, will get us to ensure that there's more accessible home care, that there is more senior-friendly communities, that there's better standards for staffing. It will take us there. I have no doubt about that. But what really matters are the relationships. They're the people working within these new structures, the people who have once been provided with adequate training, compensation, et cetera, who interact on a regular basis with those in care. So my presentation is primarily in the realm of ethics, and what I want to talk about then are three particular thematic concerns: respect, honesty, and integrity. And I hope that you'll see how these build on the sort of more substantive structural and workforce issues that you've already heard about in the past 24 hours, since yesterday. So as I anchor my comments in this, I want to say that although I'm going to use examples from the pandemic, I'm not actually going to restrict myself to that, because I think these are challenges we've had before, we're having during, and we will continue to have, and dare I say after. We're still in the midst of this pandemic, but there will be a time when we move beyond this. And we need to think about where are we with respect to these three critical commitments: respect, honesty, and integrity. Now, this is an image that may be familiar to many of you from the early days of the pandemic, when the crisis in certain long-term care facilities was such that the federal government had to send in the army to provide support. And this was especially true in Ontario, Quebec, and elsewhere. This is a striking image. This is not an image of a care provider. At least it's not one with which many of us would have thought we would become familiar. So imagine what it might have been for a patient to see persons like this in their long-term care facility. How would they have processed this information? Who is this person? What are they doing here? And imagine how frightening that might have been for a person with dementia. This does not look like your typical kind, caring care provider. And I am not saying that they did not play that role. I'm just asking you to think about the image from the perspective of a person in a long-term care facility who doesn't expect this and who may not understand what is happening around them. But more distressing from my perspective is not just this image, but the findings that were reported afterwards. Clear instances of not just lack of care, but outright elder abuse. There were graphic reports of residents being bullied, being drugged, being improperly fed, reports of cockroaches, flies, rotten food smell, old trays, people in soiled bedding. This is shameful. How do we recover from that? How do we earn back the trust that has been violated? And again, I want to emphasize that many people have said the cracks were in the system to be seen for a very long time. Everything just came to a head with the pandemic. How do we do better? Well, I think what's really important here is this concept of respect. And I want us to think about what it means to show respect for someone. And when I make my comments here about respect, I don't want to just focus on the extreme example that I have just commented on. I want us to think more generally about respect in the context of aging well, achieving a goal of ensuring that family and community are supported, included, and welcome in the care of their loved ones. And I want to insist really clearly that respect is absolutely essential to this goal. So I want to share with you what I think of as a much gentler story. My grandmother used to play Scrabble. She lived in England, I lived in Canada. I saw her maybe once a year. But when I would go, one of the things we had in common was a love for this game. Eventually, through ill health, my grandmother ended up in a long-term care facility, and I would go there still to play Scrabble with her. On my first visit to the home, we were served tea while we were playing Scrabble, and my grandmother opened up her glasses case and removed a spoon from her glasses case. And I looked at this. It seemed rather odd. I wasn't aware that many people kept a spoon in their glasses case. And she used this to stir her tea. When she'd finished, I asked her about this. I said, Nana, what are you doing? Why do you have a spoon in your glasses case? And she explained to me that in the long-term care facility, they only had plastic cutlery, and she couldn't abide by this. And so she decided she'd had her daughter bring her a proper spoon so that she had a spoon to stir her tea. The next time I came to visit, which as I've mentioned would have probably been about a year later, I also went to see my grandmother, and we were to play Scrabble, and as was the custom, tea was served. And this time my grandmother stirred her tea with the back end of the Bic pen that we were using to keep score. She no longer had her glasses case and her spoon. Again, I asked her about this. And you have to understand, my grandmother was a proper Victorian woman. I could hardly believe that she was stirring her spoon with the back of a pen. And she said to me, and I quote, because again, it's one of those sentences that marked me. She said, "Yes, it's a finishing school here. It's where they finish you off." And I think to myself, how hard would it have been to have given this woman a proper spoon for her tea? How hard would it have been to get to know her just a little bit, to know that this tiny, what would have been insignificant gesture to many would have been so important to her. So when I think about care and kindness, and it comes back to respect, it actually requires that you know something about the person in your care. And it doesn't have to be anything big, just maybe that for them, a plastic spoon isn't good enough to stir a cup of tea. So I guess the first message that I want to say is that just as we worry about the structures within which people will live and the adequate supports for those who will provide care, when do we turn our attention to the person? And when do we know that it's actually part of our job to know something important about that person? Maybe the care providers had very little interest in Scrabble. I don't know who played with my grandmother when I wasn't there. But my grandmother was born at the turn of the century, 1902. She led an interesting life. She told me stories about when the first stockings were invented, something that, I wouldn't have thought about. What do you mean you invented stockings? Of course you would have, but when? I know nothing about this. She told me about how the post used to arrive in a leather satchel by horse, and her grandfather had a key, and he was the only one that could open the leather satchel to get the post. My grandmother could have told many people lots of stories. I wonder, did anybody ever ask her about anything about her life? My grandmother did skilled embroidery. Did anybody know that she had this talent? And the point here is to say, if you weren't interested in the past and what my grandmother could tell you about the past, were you interested in the present and what it was that she could do and what her identity was much vested in? She did embroideries into her 90s. This is a picture of my grandmother and my daughter. Remember the story that I told you about her stirring her tea with the back of a Bic pen. During that very same conversation, when she told me about the finishing school where she found herself, and you have to imagine how striking a statement that was for me to hear, she also said to me, "There's so little grace left in the world." My grandmother was once a woman with dignity and grace, and I'm not sure that she felt she was at the end of her life. Is she the only person who's responsible for that feeling that she was no longer a woman with dignity and grace? Does it just disappear, or do we take it away from people? And do we do it inadvertently? I mean, I can't imagine anybody setting out to say, I am going to remove dignity and grace from this woman's life. But what is it that we don't do? What is it that falls through the cracks such that a woman who once had dignity and grace at the end of her life says there is so little grace left in the world? I want to talk to you about something else then that I also think is fundamental. It's not just this notion of respect, but it actually becomes concrete with this commitment to honesty and integrity. Together, those are the things that become important. Why? Because I think we're honest with people whom we respect, and we approach them with integrity. And when we don't do that, it actually says something about the respect or lack thereof that we have for the person. Now, very often, honesty and integrity gets taken down into the concept of truth-telling. I actually think they're different, but I wanted to make this point. In my teaching in the Faculty of Medicine, when we talk to students, we talk about the importance of truth-telling. And in that context, I try to talk about it not just about telling the truth and lying, but about the ways in which we deceive people. Why? Because partly I want that information to be nuanced, for people to understand that in some ways, we all participate in some kinds of deceptions at different times, and hopefully when we do so with good intention. So when we think about honesty and integrity, and we move this over into the realm of truth-telling or lying, it's really important to think about three different ways in which we deceive. Sometimes it's going to be inadequate disclosure, so we tell some of the truth. We don't actually tell any kind of a lie, we just withhold or conceal or suppress some information. Sometimes it's inadequate disclosure where we do actually distort and intend to mislead. And sometimes it's no disclosure where we actually withhold really important information. Now, the interesting thing is that in typical courses in medical ethics, the focus then becomes around things that have to do with a care plan. And so it's how truthful or honest have you been about the diagnosis, the prognosis, the options for treatment, the likely consequences of different choices you could make. But one of the things that I wanted to impress upon you is that this is an issue not only with respect to a care plan, but also with respect to family and with respect to the world, especially if we think of that person as living in concentric circles and being part of a range of communities. And therefore, that means that the honesty and integrity is actually important, relevant to a life trajectory. And that has to do with respect as well. So it's not just about telling the truth in order that you can get a proper consent to a proper intervention. It's about showing respect for someone in terms of ensuring that they understand the truth about a particular family circumstance, a particular world event. The example here being the pandemic. What is it that people did or didn't understand about what was happening? And how much of that might have been mediated by the person's individual capacity? Now, one of the things that's very interesting here is that in this context of honesty and integrity, many people take a very strong stand and say, well, it's better to get hurt by the truth than be comforted with a lie. And these are people who have a strong moral core that says honesty and truth-telling is always the way in which we show respect. And in this context, it's generally thought to be very wrong to tell a lie for both principled reasons, it's just wrong, and for pragmatic reasons, because the truth will eventually out. But one of the things that I think becomes really important, and this is where the issue of a commitment to truth-telling and a commitment to respect are potentially in tension, is that there can be times when the duty to do no harm makes deceiving someone ethically defensible. And so the interesting thing that I'm trying to do here is to separate out this idea of telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth as an important sign of respect, to actually talking about being honest, and that what matters is being honest and trustworthy. And I think, to be very frank, I learned this most obviously during the period in which my mother was ill. At one point while she was in care, she told me that she was going to see her mother and she was busy packing up her clothes. She was actually folding them into the bed sheet because she was literally with a bundle going to leave the hospital to go and see her mother. And I very matter-of-factly, without thinking about it, said to her, but Mom, your mother died years ago. I didn't even think that I was engaging in any kind of an important interaction at that moment in time. I thought I was just being truthful, being respectful. My mother started shaking and crying. And in the end, she screamed at me, don't you think I would know if my mother was dead? And in that context, I realized that I had actually, without even thinking about it, done more than just hurt her by telling the truth. And that, yes, it would have been good to have comforted her with what some might describe as a lie, but which I might reframe as deception, like incomplete truth. I might have said, and I would say, now if I had it to do over again, let's do that another day, Mom. And so the interesting thing then is, if here I am standing in front of you saying how important it is to be respectful, what happens when core tenets like telling the truth as a sign of respect get called into question in the context of care? Imagine a couple admitted with COVID and one of the partners dies, and the other one is asking with care and concern about her partner. What do you tell her at that moment in time? What do you tell a person with COVID who is dying, who asks you point blank, am I dying? Did I make a mistake by not getting vaccinated? These are challenging questions, but I believe we'll answer them well if we can stay focused on the idea of what it means to be caring, kind, compassionate, what it means to show respect, what it means to act with honesty and integrity, what it means to be trustworthy. This brings me to some of the work that I did some years ago around the concept of personal identity. And the important thing for me about this concept is to remind people that persons ultimately are social, relational beings. Too often we pay attention to our intellectual capacity and we think of ourselves as rational beings. And I want to constantly pull people back from that, no matter how much of our society is structured around the view that we are rational beings. I want you to see people as social, relational beings. And in that context, I've put up here two images, partly because there are different ways in which people understand persons as relational beings. With the tree trunk, what you see is this idea that at the core, as it becomes more dense, that that's how you get to the real person, the true person, and that that person is embedded in a number of concentric circles. But I think of the person more like the spider web that's very intricate, but also very fragile. It's woven into an environment that supports its structure and showcases its beauty. If this is the image that you hold of a person, you understand the importance of supports. You understand there's a life trajectory woven into this, and you understand how the threads break and put the person at risk. The important thing for what I'm about to say now is that my understanding of persons and of identity is very much relational, which means that the person doesn't exist in isolation. They exist as part of an extended community, and everyone who interacts with them is a part of that community. And you either help to hold this intricate, fragile structure together as best you can, or you contribute to breaking it. Maybe you're just an observer, but I think very often we're doing one or the other. So what I'm trying to say is that what matters about persons is that they are rooted in relationships. And so we have to have environments which nurture those relationships. In that context, I've talked about the importance of memory, which is the part that ties into the person as a rational being, the capacity to hold on to one's life story, to know who one is, what one has done, that one is important for the time that they've spent on this earth. But also what's important is belonging and recognition. Belonging and recognition speak to the importance of the relationships that people have, both past and present, private and public, close and distant. All of this is what makes the person who they are. That's an integral part of their biography. And one of the things that happens is that there are things that can rob a person of belonging and recognition. In the case of my mother, that was at risk by virtue of the underlying illness. And the point that I make when I talk about Alzheimer's and the threat that it represents to the person is that Alzheimer's, I argue, robs the person of memory. But whether or not it robs the person of belonging and recognition is actually up to us. It's not the illness that does that. It's choices we make in terms of how we understand the respect that is owed to the person who is losing her memory. But there's another context in which this comes under threat. And I saw this and learned of this with my father. Again, this concept of memory, belonging, and recognition. My father was sharp as a tack to the very end. My father died during COVID, but not of COVID. And one of the things that's really important that I saw is that his sense of belonging and recognition was threatened by COVID and the strictures that we imposed upon ourselves in order to protect ourselves and to protect others. My father was a gregarious man until the very end. I don't want you to think he's an alcoholic, though I've put up 2 pictures of him drinking a beer. But he loved to socialize. He loved people. He opened up his home to university students who could live there with him for free so that he could stay engaged in the world. And all of that fell apart in the context of COVID. He then lived alone without others. Yes, he had supports. People came in to help to clean, to cook, etc. But he couldn't go out shopping. He couldn't go to the dry cleaners anymore. He didn't go to the pharmacy to pick up his pills. Lots of people in the community helped to support, and my sister in particular was a major support. But his life shrunk tremendously. And so again, I want you to think about a context where what really matters in the context of respecting and caring for people is this notion of belonging and recognition. And with this, I want to come close to the end, and I want to return to the report that you heard a little bit about from Carol Estabrook yesterday. And here I want to put the emphasis not on the subtitle, COVID-19 and the Future of Long-Term Care, but on the actual title, Restoring Trust. I went through that document with a fine-tooth comb. There is actually no definition of trust in the document. And so I've put one up here for you. Trust involves a tacit belief in the other's goodwill and competence and explains the truster's willingness to let others get dangerously near things she cares about. I want you to think about that and what that requires of a person. I often talk about this again in the context of medical ethics teaching, what it takes for a patient to trust and to allow the physician to touch them. And in some cases, to touch them in intimate places. That's huge. And so what I'm talking about is we can put all the structures we want in place. We can provide all the supports we want in place. But if we don't do the work of recognizing that person and making sure that person understands they belong, it ultimately will all be for naught. And so my presentation ultimately is about nurturing kinder, gentler interactions. And the interesting thing is that many people talk about that in the context of respectful communication. And I've taken this from textbooks that talk about this. But then I thought I wanted to superimpose that with this rather dramatic image, because these are the images that I saw and you would have seen in the early days. And all I could think of at the time is, if these people were surrounding my mother in her state of dementia, she would have been terrified. Not of the illness, because she couldn't understand anything of the illness. She just wouldn't have been able to recognize anybody. And so in that context, I superimposed that with this image where I thought, here's someone understanding that maybe having the picture that you could still recognize would be helpful. It's a relatively small detail, but unless you're thinking about the person, belonging, and recognition, this might not have occurred to you as a really, really important thing to do. Doesn't cost a lot, doesn't require a tremendous amount of infrastructure. It does require an orientation focused on the person. And so in that context, I want to say very clearly, everyone matters. And what I've done here is I've actually taken a quote that comes from the report from the Royal Society, and interestingly that Carol Estabrook read yesterday, but I've paraphrased it because the original actually says the moral test of a government is how it treats those in the dawn of life, the children, etc. And I think it's not the moral test of a government, it's the moral test of a decent human being. I said earlier that we are all deeply social and relational beings. We only got to be who we are and where we are through others. And those others are generational. We owe others what they have already given to us. And I think sometimes we fail to see that until we see ourselves as amongst the others that might not be getting the kind of care that we would like. I think what's really important in sort of terms of closing remarks is we have still a huge problem with respect to this pandemic, because no matter what progress we make locally, we aren't actually approaching this as if it really were a pandemic. And I can't end a talk that looks at the ways in which we've responded to people close to home during the pandemic without naming that in many respects, we have still a huge moral failure on our hands. And that's because, in fact, whatever we have done, we haven't done it globally. Whatever care we have offered, we haven't done it globally. And I think many of us understand intellectually that this will prolong the pandemic, and yet we haven't done what needed to be done. And as I said, I don't think it would be responsible to end any talk that speaks about the pandemic without taking it out of a national context to a global context, because viruses know nothing about borders. The last thing I want to share with you is what I think is the most important question, the question that should be at the forefront of everyone's mind at all times. And I mean that at all times. And that is, what kind of world do we want to live in? I recently published a book in an area that's completely separate from this. It's on genome editing, heritable modification. So actually changing the genetics of gametes and embryos in order to make better humans. And many of you will think of this as science fiction. But what I do in that book is what I do with actually every topic I take on, which is that I try to bring the focus not from the minutia, but to the big picture. And the big picture is, what kind of world do you want to live in? That's the question you have to answer. I've answered it for myself very clearly. I want to live in a world that promotes equity and justice, a world that celebrates difference, a world that embraces neighborliness, reciprocity, social solidarity, and community, a world that values collegial as opposed to competitive relations. These are the values I hold. I hope that some of them are of interest to you. And I guess what I'm trying to say is if that's the kind of world you would like to live into, then bring that thinking to everything that you do, whether it's the design of the building, the training of those who will staff it, the policies that will or will not allow family caregivers into those settings, the ways in which you will have an interaction if you should ever be so lucky to play Scrabble with someone. Thank you.